MPA has explored a range of meditative, durational, theatrical, and actionist modes of performance to engage the energetic as a potential material in live work, enriched with rituals, performances, and installations, critically examine behaviors of power in personal and social spaces. MPA's work has been exhibited around the globe. In 2013, MPA received a foundation for the Contemporary Arts Grant and relocated from New York City to 29 Palms, California. And my understanding is that being there has really started some of the questions that are addressed in the exhibition, which I would encourage all of you to see. Dean and MPA have worked together, and they're going to talk a little bit about that, some of the stuff that they've done in New York. Just a couple of quick orders of business. There is a full color catalog signed and numbered by MPA that's available in the shop, and after the talk, she will be available to personalize and sign those, so I would encourage you to check that out. And then on March 25th, MPA will be back. It's a Friday at 6:30 p.m. as part of PhotoFest. So I would encourage you all to come back for that, and I'll pass it over to them.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
And there are a couple seats down front if people want to move in.
We'd love to have you.
So thanks, Felice, for a nice introduction, and thanks, everyone, for coming. I'm really, really excited to be here and to have the support of the institution to be able to have commissioned the work for the interview Red Red Future, and especially MPA for all of your hard work. It's been a real incredible journey that we've been on, and I'm really, really pleased with how everything has turned out.
Thanks, Dean.
Yeah. So the kind of structure that we're going to do is we'll talk a little bit about some older work to give you a bit of a framework for kind of MPA's extended practice, and talk about work specifically in relation to some of the things that you'll see in the exhibition. So this is actually a kind of special moment. These are images from an exhibition that I curated at Larissa Goldston Gallery in 2010 called Pièces de Résistance. It was a group exhibition, and MPA was one of the participants, and produced a piece. And MPA, maybe you can talk about physically what this piece was.
So there's a relationship on the floor that is actually 100,000 pinpoints that I hand pinpointed. We were, at the time, the US was really heavily involved in sending another 90,000 troops to the wars in the Middle East. And so I hand pricked 100,000 marks, and then I took I did 2 of those on the wall, and then I took one of the prints and I made a print. I ink blotted it and then made a print on the gallery, which of course was painted over at the end of the show, but that was part of the intention.
And so you can see that kind of triangle. It's harder to see on the floor in this image. One of the things that was actually really special about this work is you walked into the gallery and it looked like there was a kind of piece of white paper on the floor. And it wasn't until you walked around the lighting from the other side that the shadows actually came into play. So all of a sudden this triangle seemed to appear out of nowhere. And then the second triangle on the wall, I think we had a kind of, at least for me, there was a real sense that it looked like a kind of aerial photograph. And at the time in the news, there were all these images of kind of bombings in the Middle East, and you would see these kind of, aerial photographs of the land and explosions happening. And for me, there was this kind of texture in this work that seems very related to some of the aerial views, although in a very different kind of peaceable way, that exist in the work Codex that's out in the gallery. And Codex is a work, it's an aerial photograph of the Nazca lines in Peru, so a geoglyph that's literally hundreds of feet long. The prints are each individually about they're 1 foot by 1 foot, covered with glass that's been coated with photochromic dye. There's a second work which animates the piece. It's the work called ISS Clock. And that cycle of time that the work is on corresponds to the cycle of sunrises and sunsets, 16 of them, that astronauts aboard the International Space Station see every 24 hours. So roughly a sunrise or a sunset every 90 minutes. And the lights in this piece, kind of the UV lights, fade in and out and actually make this piece, mark the piece in that way. And MPA, maybe you can talk a little bit more about kind of where this piece generated from and some of the...
Well, maybe beginning to talk about this will involve us talking about a lot of aspects of the show, but as I began when I was informed of what these two projects were that have plans to take humans to Mars, and as I started asking questions of what is happening on Mars, or what will happen, or why Mars, as I engaged in that process, I was introduced to a lot of UFO researchers, and that community actually, a few conversations in that community introduced me to the Nazca Lines as a site of unknown resolution in terms of why they were made and by a who. Some people in the UFO community think that the Nazca Lines are marks made from spacecraft or from extraterrestrial beings. Visiting the lines in 2015, what I really took away was their energetic presence. I guess it's helpful to think that like a human in this is probably like a human would be like the size of the tip of my microphone, or so that it's the scale of which these exist on the ground really go unseen, and they are these massive drawings for an idea or a vision of above. And that clicked into what I was literally doing with Mars, right? So that here was this relationship on the Earth from I think that they're embedded with a lot of ancient consciousness, but this gesture to draw for the idea of above, or for a visitation from above, I was doing the reverse by trying to take apart all these projections that could be happening on Mars. And so I included them in the show as a counterbalance or a counter subject to Mars. And one in the show lays very much on the ground and is rooted in the earth, while the other one, and maybe takes the position of past time. And then on the very dramatic other opposite end of the exhibition is Mars, which I think really holds a place of future time and projection, and how the two could work a little bit on a binary with each other in the show to draw attention.
And one of the subjects I think that has come up a lot for both of us when we've been talking about things MPA is this issue of colonization, and the kind of inherent violence that happens with colonization. And I'm going to take a kind of brief moment to maybe show some images from another exhibition, which we also had the good fortune to work on together, called Directing Light onto Fist of Father. I think one of the things that we've talked about is in some ways the kind of inherent violence of that confrontation of colonization. And there was, for sure, a kind of questioning of power in this way in Directing Light onto Fist of Father, which took place in 2011. The image that you're looking at over here is, and maybe you want to talk about the work.
That's a plaster cast fist of my biological father.
And so the way that the work existed in the gallery space, this was at Leo Koenig Projects in New York, the plaster cast fist was on a glass shelf that was inserted into the wall. And there was also was 9mm or 16 millimeter looping film that MPA had made in the studio, where she was using mirrors to reflect light onto the fist.
Sunlight specifically. Yeah.
Sunlight. And so the projector, as you can see in this image, is projecting across the wall onto a mirror and being bounced up onto that top wall. At the same time, that same exhibition also included this performance called Initiation that basically kind of began the whole performance, where MPA stood for more than 2.5, almost 3 hours, I think, stock still and kind of meditating on this fist or with this fist. And maybe you can talk a little bit about some of the action that happened both with Initiation and some of the concerns around the show.
Mm-hmm. I think when we were talking about this artist talk, Dean was like, should we talk about directing light? And I said, it's probably a pretty important, it could be an important show, I guess, in reference to the work I'm doing now, for the reason that it's reflective of a process where I continue to try to figure out how to take apart not just power, but really like our ideas of power and how each of us embody possibly the structures that we might also identify as oppressing us. So Fist of Father was a version in which I was acknowledging that patriarchy, I re-perform and re-perform that even if I'm also oppressed by patriarchy. And the fist became a symbol for me of commodity, art, specifically art commodity. This was in a commercial art gallery in New York, patriarchy and white supremacy. And so to hold the fist for 2.5 hours at the opening was the way in which now I was also the shelf and the container for those power structures and those oppressions that I was literally directing a severe critical eye on. So directing light, after this is called an initiation in which I hold the fist, I'm the shelf, I'm the wall, I'm the container for that, I'm the body that holds that fist. There had a note about the nurturing and the love that can also come with critique. And then following initiation for 2 months, I would visit the gallery on any sunny day. So it's New York, it's not always sunny. And I would stand outside with a mirror, usually across the street, and I would direct the sunlight into the gallery front window onto the fist on the shelf. And that became this really beautiful, meditative ritual to directing not just light onto a source of power, but as maybe a possible another version of critiquing, that there was this gentleness, right? And that looks a little different than maybe some of the acts I do as, protesting in the street, or maybe even some of the feminist rage that I've let out in like a barroom conversation, So this was a really different, subtle and tense conversation of critique. The other thing about this show is this was 2011, so for anyone who was in New York then, Occupy Wall Street started 2 days right after this show opened, and within 3 weeks I put a sign and stepped out of my own self-assignment to go to the gallery on a daily basis and said, the act of directing light on Fist of Father, that act is now downtown at Zuccotti Park. And for anyone who's unaware, a group of activists occupied Zuccotti Park in New York for two months and 10 days. And it was an incredible convergence. It was a political uprising. And I do think it was the place in which people were directing a lot of light, a lot of critique on a lot of sources of power. And so it might just speak, I think, to that there's this political fever usually riding in all of this process. And, at the time that one might come to art with those kinds of emotions, it's always, I think that I make sometimes this artwork too so that it can show me back where I'm at, even in a lot of these resistant thinkings.
And I think one of the things, well, we should note also the footage that you're looking at was footage of the exhibition that was shot by Sadie Benning for MPA. But one of the things also that I think in terms of thinking about that occupation of Zuccotti Park and these collaborations that begin to happen with those kind of groups of people who come together as communities, one of the things that you did do was that it was not only you solely kind of directing light. There were actually multiple kind of mirror fragments, and so you could have groups of people who were given mirrors, and they would kind of pass the light up and down the street and across the street to each other in order to kind of bounce that light into the gallery at that fist. And there was something about that kind of collective energy for me that felt really special at that moment, especially thinking about the way that things were happening with all the activity that you were involved in at Occupy. So then kind of continuing on, maybe we can go to kind of talk a little bit about some of the aspects of how photography has kind of played a part in your work.
Yeah.
And specifically photography and the photographic image in relation to performance, but as a kind of autonomous work. And maybe you can talk a little bit about the significance for you of live frame in that way.
Live frame, we can just talk pretty quickly about this, but this just is a time in which, having performed so much, you collect all this documentation, and often, I mean, I'm not alone in this, for many performers, you sit there and it's this disappointing representation of something that had a really, energetic life to it. And live frame, you might relate. So this was me really, so basically realizing that I didn't have to use the documentation. It might seem so trite, but I didn't have to use documentation as documentation was coming back to me. And it's a very simple recollage, and it's saying this is the only thing that remains of this performance. This performance was from London in 2011, and it was a half-an-hour performance, and there's video, and there's loads of photos, and instead I thought, what was more interesting was the moment in which the person was stuttering. That there's a moment that seemed more live than the sea of documentation of that particular performance. And what I mean by that is that moment that the documenter actually clicks and then clicks out of focus and then clicks again, I wanted to isolate that moment. But what it did is it also directed me to looking at a lot of photographs, and it led me to picking up the camera again, which is now reflected in the exhibit we made together.
And I think maybe we could talk very specifically about the work I, which is one of the smaller works that you see as you're kind of entering the gallery to your right. And in that, there's a moment where you are actually taking the red frame, which is also included in the exhibition, out into the desert in Joshua Tree, and using it to kind of as a prop, as a frame for some staged photographs. And maybe you can talk a little bit about what that process was like for you.
Well, I'm a really frequent collaborator, and I've been lately I've been able to locate some of those actions as being a muse to a lot of friendly artists, and being in a community. I'm part of a really enriching community of people that are constantly sharing and playing to even an embarrassing limit, so I'm saying that because I was in front of many people's cameras for many years, and I loved that role. I'm an exhibitionist at heart. I love playing in front of the camera. I love if we're in somebody's studio. I have one friend is coming to mind, Lighty Churchman, who's a painter, so it's not even a camera. But I would go in a studio and it's what if we paint your thigh and throw some, some paint over there? And later that developed in him making some floor paintings. And those kinds of relationships I think are, essential as artists. And having spent so much time doing that, it was a specific change when I moved to this desert, really away from my, New York community, and living much more now a smaller, I guess, kind of studio practice where it was really with myself and my partner and our animal. And I took the camera on myself and I started doing these performances on the platforms these abandoned homesteader shacks in 29 Palms, California, where I live. And that began this theater of emotions I was testing around ideas around Mars. So talking to different astrologers or psychics, Mars has an influence. It's usually associated with the masculine energy. It's definitely, that's the interview, I bet, calling right now, but I'm unavailable. We're right next door. I think I was saying, just quickly that
with Mars and kind of war and aggression, which will
right.
actually lead us
yeah.
into a nice
so
spot.
talking to some of these astrologers, that what are the characteristics of Mars? It's a warrior. It rules war. It's the doer. It's an action planet. It's the thing that propels energies. That's why it's often associated to a lot of loud, passionate, aggressive energies. And I was performing some of those feelings on these platforms. Those photographs, we edited out of the show. They were taking a little too much, I think, figurative attention, but we both resolved to one. Probably out of, I don't know, there was like a
10, 12 at least that we looked at in the beginning.
And it's called I, and it actually felt better in its loneliness than in the collection of these figurative expressions. And that is really, it's not a self-portrait, it's definitely acting. But it was trying to channel, I think, that warrior energy and that warrior gaze that I think is a player with Mars. Where are you going now? Ooh.
So I think in terms of thinking about those ideas of that aggression and how those things can play out, maybe we'll kind of jump in a couple minutes into a performance that MPA presented at the invitation of Julia Paoli, who was at the Center for Curatorial Studies at Bard College. So it was part of an exhibition in which a number of artists, MPA included, were invited to respond to works in the Hessel collection at the museum. And basically there were two things that I think kind of really came into play very specifically in this. One was Louise Bourgeois bronze called Hanging Janis, which maybe we should just take a look at the beginning so you kind of see that work. And I think there's, as kind of often, there's a real kind of call to action, a kind of a beginning of a ritual. So this idea of this kind of dedication to ritual action is something that kind of often, begins or kicks off some of the live performance work that you're doing. So we're going a little further.
Sure. I think I know where you're going to go.
Do you want to go there?
Go ahead.
So this is a recreation or a Carl Andre piece called Transit. I also don't want to kill the joy in this, but Carl Andre's Transit is a work in the Hessel collection. This, of course, is a reproduction of that work, a very faithful reproduction, so no artworks were damaged.
Although people believed it for a moment.
People believed it, yeah. Should we move a little further in?
A little backwards.
Backwards.
So I think you're showing that because the Mars energy.
Yeah, it got worse for Carl. He was covered with Diwali pigments, googly eyes, glue, pom-pom, like, little yarn pom-poms, some laser printed contact paper. And for me, there was that energy, that kind of Mars energy that's in that work, feels somehow really important also in kind of thinking about the violence that happens to other bodies. I mean, of course, in a way for me, the kind of real player in this is maybe an Ana Mendieta, all these figures that have experienced this kind of violence. And that colonized body somehow figures into this for me.
I mean, when I see this piece, it can be awkward. Maybe this is one of these kinds of pieces that's like, you see your documentation and it's difficult to, I think it's a difficult representation, but it is a piece that reminds me of how much I believe and I love in performance. The energy in the room when this was happening was incredible. I think there was 200 people. It was a big day of people at CCS Bard. And I think that a lot of things were going on into, you have the distilled, pristine, white wall museum space, and someone's doing that, breaking that tension and touching the artwork. And then further than that, I mean, it's an enormous display of like feminist rage. So, I mean, I was surprised how many people believed it was really Carl Andre and that nobody would have interrupted me from, defaming it in that way. But again, it's a kind of work for me that situates, as I said, like maybe directing Light Fist of Father, or the kind of work I'm making now, there's kind of been an evolution in terms of like what critique looks like. I don't want to at all underestimate my own feminist rage or anybody's acts on that. I think that there is a need for the warrior. And this day, this is what, you know, might have been necessary that day, that warrior self that wanted to articulate, I think, a really invisible violence that goes on, an unspoken history of around a lot of like male artists and behaviors that occurred with their female counterparts, not just as wives, but as collaborators and comrades. And in 2011, being invited into the Hessel collection, an amazing collection by Mary Louise Hessel, who has iconic feminist works in her collection, maybe there was a little bit of her friendliness that even said, it's okay for me to show you this anger. It's okay for me to make this poem, this live poem, with your artworks. But I have to say how much I love performance to do that. When you're sitting in this room like we're sitting in, and action like that happens, we're all somehow drawing each other. I think the performer takes, of course, a leading role in that, but the performer is often, you know, the performer is still so susceptible to the drawing gaze of the audience to supply the charge. And it is something I believe that we do together, which might, I think we can stop watching this.
Well, that might be a nice segue too to kind of talk a bit about the interview.
I mean, we were at a breakfast this morning with some folks that had gone to the interview last night, and they asked me why make that piece, and it's around that same thing that I really believe in our human connection. I mean, I'm trying to sit up here and be, try to unmask for you a bit, like the performance of being on a panel of sorts, but I really believe that where we're at right now in our humanity, like we have to start speaking to each other about the very futures that frighten us, but also the very futures that excite us.
And sorry, the interview, for those of you who may not have had an opportunity to look at the exhibition yet, is an artwork. We've got a telephone in the space for starting yesterday and for the entire 3 months of the exhibition. If you pick up this hotline telephone, it dials someone. We will not.
It's me.
And basically you get to have a kind of one-on-one conversation. At first, we had actually kind of thought about like, okay, here are the questions that are going to be asked, and then you realize kind of further into it that it was going to be a kind of evolving process. That it wasn't just going to be 2 questions. It was going to be engaging people and listening back to people, being interviewed by people as much as you're asking them questions. And I think that kind of one-on-one aspect of it, the intimacy that allows, and the kind of really unprecedented access to you over the course of this exhibition is really remarkable for me. Both in terms of how it engages the imaginations of viewers. I mean, we had like 5 and 6-year-olds and 9-year-olds yesterday on the phone, kind of telling you things, as well as people who had some really interesting and kind of provocative ideas about Mars and colonization. And maybe you can kind of talk a little bit about, I mean, I know we're not very far into the process, but maybe to talk a little bit more about the ideas that motivated that.
Well, the leading idea was that when I learned about Mars One and NASA, both of those projects were like saturated in this conquest language that felt all too familiar as the colonization formula that we might have seen most dramatically in our human history played out with the Atlantic slave trade and the genocide of First Nations people in some of these very lands that we're sitting in. And so when you read about ships and investors organizing to begin human colonies, literally, on the Red Planet, it just rang my alarms, you know, of saying, oh, there's that language again, and why is that, what is that narrative, what is that script that we continue, I'm using a huge, ginormous large we there, but you know, that humans, or you could say a group of humans, continues to follow. What is that script? Why is exploration by Western institutions so often the culprit of performing these enormous and like unexplainable and irreparable violences on other bodies? That said, interestingly enough, I've become in this journey of thinking of Mars and these voyages these space voyages that are being planned by 2027, 2030, slightly askew at the present moment, thinking of Mars less as a destination point, but possibly as the mirror that makes us look back on our humanity here on Earth. And that's what the live line and making the exhibition have this active liveness really comes back to, is it says, who are we right now? Do we have options in this humanity? Can we change course? I think there's a lot of apocalypse fever that has been brewing. Hollywood's done a great job of that, in the last decade, that I think even works to the degree of desiring it. People are desiring end as much as we might also be fearing end. And so all of these questions said, I want to talk about it. And that's the ambition there, is that we can connect over telephone, disembodied body. That was a big theme with my friend Harry this morning too, about talking about the absence that's in the show as much as so much presence. And that's the ambition. And last night was the first time we made the phone active. And I personally came out from that experience with like a lot of energy and like this kind of permanent smile, because of how willing people were to talk about this. And this was mainly around Mars. There was a lot of themes of talking about people's sadness about Earth, actually, that could cause a little welling up right now. There was a lot of people wanted to share about how sad they are right now for Earth. And that's important as well, So I'm very excited to do this work for the next 3 months, and I think I think that looking at that exhibition a little bit too, if you could also look at it as another, I guess, like a bit of a poetic justice in terms of some of the themes I'm talking about, in terms of those kinds of violence that are perpetuated by capitalism, married to white supremacy, married to patriarchy. That formula really binds, I think, this history that I'm talking about that is like irreparably violent.
And then I think maybe one of the last pieces, we can talk a little bit about the long line and open up to questions afterwards from the audience. But in that way, there are these other kinds of through lines in the exhibition, and specifically, I think, the long line, which kind of winds its way through the space and links Mars and links Codex in there, is a work that was made where MPA was picking up objects as she was walking through the desert near 29 Palms, where she lives, and kind of starting to collect these things. And Kai, her partner, kind of got some credit from MPA for saying, like, oh, these things that you've been collecting, like, these are important work. And so what ends up happening is this kind of line that, in a very simple way for me, almost functions as though it's a kind of bird's eye view of a path through the desert and what was found along that path, but also in a kind of more complex and poetic and metaphoric way. It's very much also a kind of bloodline, thinking about these issues of colonization, and I think probably more importantly, that aspect of things, of thinking about how lines are drawn to divide people, to divide property, etc. And maybe you can talk a little bit about this work, and then we'll kind of open up to questions from the audience if you have any.
The long line is really unconscious work, and maybe there's some of the other things, especially thinking about Mars. It was a kind of project that was like a lot of research, a lot of, that's not always how I approach making something, but a lot of like, what is this Mars One? Why is Lockheed Martin on one of their sponsors? You know, this kind of like making lists in the studio. And Long Line was purely unconscious and really, I think is, you know, reflects like my time of leaving the city and moving in the desert, and a lot of things that Dean just said of like, of migrating from, and I watch this when people come to visit us in the desert a lot too, is that at first it's like you're collecting the cool stones and the foliage looks interesting. But I quickly left collecting stones to collecting plastic. And if it's like rotting plastic, it was really interesting, you know, and it got like special place on the shelf. But I think it speaks for itself that, you know, what happens with this man-made object that's becoming brittle under and drying out under the sun, and then goes back to becoming dust, you know, and we grow our vegetables in it, you know. So I think that's, I mean, long line in there, I think kind of, I would prefer it to like speak for itself. I think it has a lot of poetry in it that says it better than I'm going to say it.